Um, Good afternoon, those of us who are in Nairobi, our nation's capital. I just want to take this opportunity to welcome all of us to our seminar this afternoon. I'm trying to, yes. So welcome to our seminar this afternoon. Those friends of ours who are online and those who are here. We have those of us from the University of Nairobi, and I can see a number of our friends from different universities around the world. There's Andrew there from University of California. There's Ian from Warwick. There's Soja here from Longspur. And my colleagues and our students, I just want to welcome you to our seminar this afternoon. We are very privileged to have one of the leading scholars, I think, in this continent, Professor Saleem Badat from the University of University of South Africa. I'll mention it just in a moment. And he's going to speak to us on a subject that he has entitled Conceptually Framing Historical Research on the Purposes, Functions, Goals, and Roles of Universities in Africa. Professor Saleem got his education in different parts of the world. He got his early education in KwaZulu-Natal and Boston University, and he holds a PhD from the University of York. Currently, he is a research professor in the Department of History, University of the Free State in South Africa. But also more importantly, he has served as the Vice-chancellor of Rhodes University in South Africa between 2006 and 2014. That's why we thought it is very necessary that he pays a courtesy call to our Vice-chancellor before he comes to this seminar, and that has delayed us for just a few minutes. Previously, Professor Saleem taught at the University of the Western Cape, and in 1999, he was actually the CEO of the Council on Higher Education, the advisory body to the Ministry of Higher Education and Training in South Africa. But also, he was a program director of international higher education and strategic projects at the Mellon Foundation in New York. And at that time, he was really directing grant making in social sciences and humanities to universities in Africa and the Middle East. Professor is very widely published. He has done quite a bit of books, but his most important book is Tennis, Apartheid, and Social Justice in South Africa, which has just come out, 2023. Very important. The other one is The Forgotten People, Political Banishment under Apartheid, 2012, and many others. In the seminar today, Prof is going to present a conceptual framing of his research for a book on the history of universities in South Africa. And he will be more specifically dwell on the idea of the university in South Africa, the university in quotes in South Africa. He's not so much concerned with empirical details, but with the conceptual and methodological plane, how to research and write a book on the history of universities in South Africa, and what is their concern, what is their purposes, what is their goals, roles, and to what extent has that changed over time. There's a lot I can say about Prof, but if I continued, then I might end up preempting what he is going to say in his presentation. So, ladies and gentlemen, without much ado, it is now my pleasure and singular honor to welcome Professor Saleem Badat to speak to us in this Nairobi afternoon. My name is Kenneth Obongi. I come from the Department of History and Archaeology. Prof, please, over to you.
Good afternoon, and thank you for this opportunity to engage with you on my research on the history of universities in South Africa, and specifically on the idea of the university, something we take for granted, and also something that I'm increasingly becoming concerned that we don't understand fully in terms of what its functions are in society, what its purposes, what its goals, and so on. In fact, I have a fear that many of the institutions that have the word university in them may not really be universities. They may be something else. Call them what you want. I don't care. College, institute, school. But for me, the university is a very treasured idea. And not every institution is necessarily a university. Every university is a higher education institution, but not every higher education institution is a university, is perhaps the best way I can put it. So I will be presenting in 5 steps. And they're not all equal in terms of the attention I'll pay to them. Firstly, why a book on the historical development of universities in South Africa? Secondly, I want to say something about the development of universities in South Africa. Thirdly, what are the concerns that I have when I'm researching and writing this book? Okay? And this is really a 5-year project. The book's not going to come out next week. Fourthly, I want to then engage around conceptually framing. And I've highlighted that because that's what I really want to talk about. I can give you a lot of empirical details on when the first university started and where it started and all that. For the moment, I'm not interested in that. Like any PhD student, I want the questions to be clear. I want the methodology to be clear. I want to clarify the theoretical approach, if you like, before rushing in to do empirical work and visiting archives and things like that. And then I want to make a few concluding comments. And what I would like to invite you who come from other countries or from Kenya is really to engage as I'm speaking about your own institutions in Kenya. Where do your universities come from? What are their purposes? When were they established? What are their goals and roles and functions, and so on? Okay. And I'll spend some time explicating how I understand, because these are not synonyms. I'm not wanting to be long-winded by repeating words. No, purposes is different from functions, is different from goals, is different from roles, is different from objects. Each one of that is a concept, right? And we know as scholars, concepts are important. If we want to dig a hole, we don't use a teaspoon, right? We use a spade, hopefully. So concepts is what we as scholars use to make sense of the world, to make sense of reality. And then on the basis of the concepts and assumptions and so on, we claim to explain the world. That's what theory is. We theorize. And we do it modestly, because maybe our theorization is not actually accurate. Even the sciences which imagine that their theorizing is absolutely clear are discovering that maybe the theories have to be rethought. So what we have available to us as scholars are concepts and theories to understand realities. Okay? So why a book on the historical development of universities in South Africa? Well, firstly and foremost, why do I want to waste 5 years of my life doing something if there's something that already exists? Remarkably, there is no book on the history of universities in South Africa. So there's one good reason to write a book on the history of universities, but that's not the only reason. Secondly, I think that when we do this research, I will be able to analyze and illuminate the relationship between colonialism and apartheid and the development of universities, and how colonialism and apartheid shaped the universities that we have today. That's what I'm interested in. If you like, a political economy of universities, a historical sociology of universities in South Africa. Think Kenya all the time, right? Because I'm looking forward to that engagement about, because Kenya is not South Africa. Okay. So, and many of you in this room might be historians. I was saying to Professor Mbongi, some of you may say, who's this interloper? He's not a historian. How dare he does something on the history of universities? I know we are territorial. I don't actually have a discipline, if you like. My PhD is in sociology, but all my research has been historical sociological. Right? I take as a critical not just any kind of sociologist. That's why I don't even call myself a sociologist. I come from a tradition that is called Marxist political economy. Right? So critical theory, if you like, it's the closest. And I take history seriously as a critical theorist. In the same way, I think historians should take sociologists a bit seriously at times too, because it can provide you with concepts to understand reality, because that's what we do as scholars, right? If you're not trying to understand reality, what are we doing? And for me, it's about trying to understand reality in order to change reality for the better, to put an end to oppression and exploitation that we find in our societies. So my task is not about just writing books for the sake of writing books and becoming famous. I'm trying to intervene in reality to change reality, so there can be social justice in our societies. Okay, so I'm making my assumptions clear to you, because I think we should all make our assumptions clear to each other, why we are doing these things. To become rich, to become famous, or to be on the side, as Fanon puts it, of the wretched of the earth, the people who are downtrodden in our societies. Okay. Third reason, rightly, there's more focus today on the relationships between our universities and slavery and other oppressive systems. Look what's happening in the United States. When Georgetown accepts the fact that Georgetown would not exist unless it sold those slaves. When Georgetown was in trouble, it sold slaves in order for it to keep going. Harvard University has just committed $100 million to come to grips with its slave past, because Harvard was funded through slavery, right? Everyone applauded. $100 million, not me. The last time I looked, Harvard has got $56 billion endowments. What is $100 million? Doesn't go very far. If you are serious about coming to grips with your slave past and restitution and reparations, right? So we need to analyze where our universities come from and what they have been built on. Because as Faulkner says, the past is never dead. The past is not even past. The past lives on in the present. It shapes our institutions, including universities. And my last reason why I'm doing this work, and perhaps the most interesting for me, is that this kind of historical research, historians are important. This kind of historical research can help us, if we are serious about this, transform our universities. That's what Black Lives Matter is demanding. That's what the student protest in 2015 and 16 is demanding. I come from a student militant background myself, going back to the late 70s. I've never left universities. I'm interested in transforming universities because I believe that in South Africa, what we have today are universities in South Africa. We don't have South African universities in the way that Harvard is an American university and in the way that Oxford is a British university. I don't believe that in Africa we have African universities. We have universities in Africa that came with the colonialists. And we are still being shaped by those conceptions of what a university is. Okay? So you see, this is not just about writing books. There's a lot at stake. It is about transforming. It is about decolonizing. It is about Africanizing. Because these universities are historical and cultural. Okay? I mean, in what language does Harvard teach? English, right? What does Oxford teach in? English, right? What language do we teach? English. Why? Why not Swahili? Why not Xhosa in South Africa? Is it natural that we just teach in English? How much sense can we make of reality if it's only going to be in English? Are concepts not related to our history and our culture? So this is a challenge for all of us. Okay, so let me say something about the development of universities in South Africa. And I have to thank my friend there because we are synchronizing the slides and my talking. Okay, so very quickly, the development of universities in South Africa, and think about Kenya or think of your own societies, right? If you're American, as I think someone is, 1500s with Harvard and so on. UK, Oxford, Cambridge, 11th century, right? So in Africa or in South Africa, universities, no, let me re-say, not universities, higher education institutions arose in the mid-1800s. And over time, some of those higher education institutions became university colleges and eventually became universities. Right? And so the first so-called university in South Africa, the University of the Cape of Good Hope, that arises in 1873. It's not a university, really. It is an examining body with a charter from the University of London. It's not a South African university. Its origins are in the University of London, like in many other places in Africa, actually. It did no teaching, it did no research. But by the way, even at Oxford and Cambridge, there was no research for centuries. It was just teaching institutions, okay? And then during the segregation period, between 1910 and 1948, now think Kenya, because you may have a different way of periodizing. I'll come back to this issue of periodizing in history, right? But in South Africa, we can divide different periods in South Africa, right? So we speak about the colonial period between 1652 when the Dutch colonized us, and then the British came and took over in 1809. That first period between 1652 and 1910, we call the colonial period. Then the colonial period gives way to what we call the segregation period between 1910 and 1948. Okay? And that's when the first universities arise. They arise through private funding. by rich people, right? But they didn't have to arise, because before that, what was happening? They were going to the UK. They were going to Edinburgh. They were going to Oxford, Cambridge, those kinds of places, right? So why do they want universities in South Africa now? Why do they want higher education institutions in South Africa? Why are the rich people there who are white, right? Because by that time, indigenous people have been dispossessed of their land, conquest, colonial brutality, subjugation. By 1913, 87% of the land in South Africa is monopolized by 5% of the population that's white. It's that context in which the first universities arrived between 1910 and 1948. And interestingly, unlike the United States, these are all public universities. They're not private, like Yale and Harvard and Princeton. That's a big distinction. Public universities, private universities, okay? During that same period, 1910 to 1948, one institution is created, the South African Native College. Look at the word, Native College. Missionaries from Scotland create that institution in the Eastern Cape, which is areas that were initially colonized, right? That eventually becomes the famous University of Fort Hare, where Nelson Mandela and Walter Sisulu and Robert Mugabe and all go to. That's the only university they could go to as Black people, because those other 5 public universities were for whites only, and not for all whites either. Rich whites, middle-class whites, and not all whites either. Men, not women. That's how our universities start. They are gendered institutions right from the start. They are for men, not for women, right? Then, in 1948, the National Party comes to power on the ticket of apartheid. But what the National Party does between 1948 and 1990 as the apartheid state, right? It doesn't start anything brand new. It builds on segregation that the British introduced. So when everyone wants to speak about the nasty Nats and the apartheid period, they were building on what the British had already introduced to South Africa and elsewhere. Except we just say this was now segregation on steroids, because everything was compartmentalized, everything. Schools, hospitals, sports grounds, everything. Yet, interestingly, during that apartheid period, more universities are created exclusively for white or Black. And so the white universities that are created are according to either Afrikaans, which is a variation of Dutch, or English. And the Black universities that are created from 1959 onwards are along ethnic lines. If you are Zulu speaking, you go to the University of Zululand. If you are Xhosa speaking, you now go to the University of Fort Hare, which is taken over in 59. It's no longer, University of Fort Hare, when it was created in 1916, is a non-racial university. Anyone can go there. It was not reserved for white or Black, but eventually it becomes largely Black. And in 59, when the apartheid government takes over, they make it only for Xhosa speaking, right? And then another university is created in the north of the country that is only for Venda, Pedi, Sotho-speaking people. And then 2 other universities are created for Black people, one in Durban for Indian South Africans like myself. And another one is created for colored South Africans in Cape Town. What the students who attend that, like me, begin to call, interesting word, what do we call them? Bush colleges. Why? Because they are put in rural areas. They're not in cities. Why do you think they put them in the rural areas? I've just spent the last 10 days visiting institutions that I've never visited before. I've never been out of Nairobi before. I've just come back from visiting Moi University, Maseno, and Seku. Seems very familiar. What are these universities doing where they are? Why were they put there? Look at Seku in Kitui, not even in Kitui, kilometers out of Kitui. You see why in South Africa we call them bush colleges. There's a reason why they were located there and not in Cape Town or Johannesburg or Durban in the big cities. It was about political control. It was not about knowledge and education. Because usually universities are urban institutions. I'm not saying that's right, but usually that's the case. Okay? Or they're in big cities or towns. So then, when apartheid gives way through liberalization in 1990 and negotiated settlement, we have 36 universities, but they are all along racial lines. Black, white, English-speaking, Afrikaans-speaking, colored, Indian, and so on. And then in 2001, when I was head of the advisory body to the minister, one of the first things the minister asked us, so what are we going to do about these 36 universities? Because as he rightly said, these 36 universities, in a beautiful term he used, he said, he was a human rights lawyer who was in exile for many years in Ireland at Trinity College. He describes the 36 universities as the product of the geopolitical imagination of apartheid planners. That's exactly what they were. The geopolitical imagination of apartheid planners and the segregationists, okay? And so through a lot of research, through a lot of consultation, we reduced those 36 universities to 23. Today we have 26 universities. Because in some cases, like in Durban, all you have to do is kick the fence down, because that side was a black university and this side was a white university. Kick the fence down, one university. Okay? At least we had the courage in South Africa to do that, to reduce the 36 to 23 so that it could serve a developing democracy in a far better way than what the people who were the planners of apartheid and segregation intended. So, and those 23 universities today are not divided on ethnic and racial lines. They are divided as research universities, teaching universities, essentially, comprehensive universities, universities of technology, specialization. Not every university is meant to do the same thing. Oxford is not Loughborough. Loughborough is not Warwick. Warwick is not York, my alma mater. Okay. Okay, so what are the key concerns of the book? What should South African universities be for? What should be their purposes, functions, goals, and roles? Note, I'm talking now about South African. The question is forward-looking. I'm coming to it through history, right? But the question is forward-looking. It concerns South African universities rather than what has existed historically, as I've said, universities in South Africa. To put it more sharply, what we have in South Africa today are universities that are not wholly of South Africa, or even for the vast majority of the people in South Africa. The university that I became Vice-chancellor of in 2006 is a 102-year-old institution. I become the first Black Vice-chancellor of that university in its history. And when I become Vice-chancellor, I'm highly aware that this university called Rhodes University, the arch-imperialist Cecil John Rhodes. You know the Rhodes scholarships? The money comes from him too, right? That university is not considered off the Eastern Cape or for the Eastern Cape. It is considered simply as in the Eastern Cape. The population, the majority Black population of the Eastern Cape do not see Rhodes as being off or for. And if you're not off or for, do you think they're going to embrace the university? Why should they? It's simply in. It was imposed, and it stands on land that was forcibly colonized. And it is in a town called Graham's Town. And Graham was a colonel. And Graham was the butcher, the British soldier, who thought nothing of massacring women and children as part of colonial conquest and dispossession. You see the contradictions. Rhodes University, Graham's Town. And the university's logo has got something from the Graham family. How do you think people will come from that area, like my friend Shepherd Marty, who comes from that area, whose land was dispossessed? How do you think he feels about that university? The past is never past. The past lives on today in people like Shepherd Marty and others. Okay? Shepherd Marty would not even be alive today if he didn't have a great, brave great-great-grandmother who, when Colonel Graham was pursuing them and killing as part of colonial conquest and dispossession, they wanted to kill Shepherd Marty's great-great-grandfather. Why? Because they were afraid that he would cry. And then they would know where they are. His grandmother said to the men, "You will have to kill me before you kill the child." That's why Shepherd Marty is alive, because of a brave great-great-grandmother. I'm trying to illustrate this, that we are talking about institutions that are not just institutions, they have histories, that people relate to these institutions in different ways. They don't all flock and say, "Wonderful Rhodes University, where I'm going to get a PhD." Some people come there and it is traumatic for them. Shepherd Marty will tell you, and I know this because we are friends in the student movement, he almost became an alcoholic because of that trauma of being at an institution that is in the area that was colonized and where they were dispossessed. The past is not past. Okay, so what is my aim? Let's get on to the conceptual methodological issues now. So my aim, like every good PhD student should have an aim for their PhD or for their master's, is to describe and analyze the purposes, functions, goals, roles, and objects that were defined for specific universities in South Africa, University of Cape Town, Rhodes University, Zululand, and so on, and for universities more generally between the mid-1800s and today. That's what my aim is. That's what the book is going to be about. It's not like a 1,000-page about every university. I have a big project where we are working on the histories of 7 universities in South Africa at the moment. I have a PhD student, I have a postdoc, I've got early career scholars working on the University of Zululand, the University of Stellenbosch, the University of Pretoria, and so on. That's the big project, the histories of universities in South Africa. My own one is about the history of the universities in South Africa in terms of this, okay? That's my aim. What are my objectives? There's a relationship between aim and objectives. You can call an aim a goal too, but why am I using the term objectives? Because I'm not repeating myself. Aim is different from objectives. Objectives are about more specific reasons why I'm doing this. So my objectives within that overall big aim is how and by whom were the purposes, functions, goals, roles, and objects defined. I'll come to what I mean by objects. Objects is not objectives. These are all concepts. How did this purpose come to be constituted? They don't just fall from heaven. They don't just come out of the Quran or the Bible or the Torah. Humans constitute these things. So how did these purposes come to be constituted? Who said that this should be the purposes of the universities? Right? What conditions, ideas, and actions shaped these definitions? How are they shaped by time and space and place? Place is hugely important. I can't speak too much about place in this. Place is huge. This is Kenya. This is not South Africa. This is not the UK. Place must have some meaning for universities. Cairo is not New York. How did these definitions change over? Because how we see a university 100 years ago is not necessarily how we see it today. So how did these definitions change over there? Or why did they change? That's what scholars should be asking. Why did they change? And then, did the actual pursuits of what universities did differ from what they stated they were going to do? To what extent? In what ways and why? Because they may have stated something on paper, but they may have done something else. And any of you who are interested in policy, and I've spent enough time of my life on policy, and I'm not interested in policy anymore, sorry. Policy is important, I'm more interested in history. Because in most countries, we do wonderful policy research. Does anyone listen? Do the politicians listen? They have their own agendas, right? So if you want to know what realities are, if you want to know what is really happening, don't read policy documents. That's like wonderful flowery stuff. Go and look at what actually is happening. Because texts are not policy necessarily. Texts are the starting point of policy. The green paper, the white paper, the policy document. Go and look at what is actually happening, and maybe then you'll understand what the real policies are. Policy as practices, okay? So that's the objectives. So what are my objects of my research now? Not objectives now, objects. Objects is saying that if I want to fulfill these aims, if I want to fulfill these objectives, what is it that I need to focus on? What is it that I need to do in order to have a book on universities in South Africa that satisfies these aims? So what do I need to do? I need to immerse myself on the South African literature, on the development of universities and higher education, right? I need to go into the archives. I need to understand when University of Cape Town was created, why it was created, what was the founding acts, who wanted the University of Cape Town, who didn't want the University of Cape Town, what were the conflicts, right? I need to look at the international literature, especially in former British colonies. And that's why, alongside this research, with Professor Mbongi, with people hopefully from Nigeria, people from Egypt, people from Malaysia, people from the West Indies, we have made a proposal to Codestria to fund a big project for us. So we can look at when universities came up in all those places, West Indies, Malaysia, Egypt, Kenya, South Africa, and Nigeria. So we can see what was different and what was common, because these were all British colonies. And they were talking to each other. India, right? But I also am wanting to look at how universities came up in Australia, New Zealand. Why? Because they were British colonies too. But they were white settler colonies. So maybe the approach there would be different from Kenya and Nigeria and places like that. I need to look at the laws, the regulations, the policy making, policy documents. I need to look at other literature, because sometimes when you read autobiographies of those colonialists, or you read biographies, you can learn something from those things. I need to look at some of the newspapers. What were they saying in the newspapers when they were wanting to create universities? Because not everyone was necessarily for universities. Some people said, we can keep sending our children to England. Why do we have to create universities here? Not everyone wanted universities. What did the business people say? Did they want universities or did they not want universities? And so on. And then I have to look at the political, the economic, the social conditions and the ideas that were floating around at that time. And those ideas included, guys, the ideas that whites were superior to blacks. They were racist ideas. And so if you think of black peoples as inferior, why do you need universities? We were told in 1953 by the Prime Minister of South Africa, what's the point of teaching black people mathematics? What are they going to do with that? They're not even capable. They're not civilized. So why do we want to teach maths? Yet 6 years later, that same Prime Minister creates new universities for black people. What happened? Was he suddenly converted? History can teach us a lot if we take it seriously. Okay. So let's get on to the conceptual framing part, which is I'm most interested. Okay. And this is where some of you, our historians, may be a little challenged, because you may say, this is not how we do it. Well, this is how Saleem's going to do it. But I want to be enriched by you to say, what about this? What about that? Right. So I start off with conceptual framing 1. First point. Universities exist in time, space, and place. Understand that. They exist in time. Bologna in 1099 is not Nairobi in 1940s. Secondly, they have specific origins. The University of Cape Town arises in 1918, much earlier than some of the Kenyan and other universities. Why? They have particular values and traditions. You know, when we have graduation ceremonies at Rhodes University, when I became Vice-chancellor, we have our graduation ceremonies, which are beautiful things, in summer. The gown I wear as a Vice-chancellor, I lose like 5 kilograms by the time the graduation ceremonies are over. Because that gown is heavy. You know where it comes from? What it's modeled on? Oxford, Cambridge. We've just adopted that for a climate that's completely different. We think because Oxford does that, we must do it like that. So we wear these crazy gowns. The rituals are like English. The songs that are sung are in Latin. Who understands Latin? We haven't even changed those things. Why? Because we're scared. So we change the gowns, we change the Latin, people will say we're not universities anymore. Really? They serve different purposes. They undertake specific functions and they pursue a variety of goals. And they demonstrate continuities and discontinuities as they adapt to changing ideological, political, and economic conditions. Kenya in 1940s is not Kenya in the 1990s, is not Kenya in 2015. Conditions change ideologically, politically. We now live under the ethos and the pressure of something called neoliberalism, which is profoundly shaping our universities and making us into factories of the production of students. Things change. There are continuities and there are discontinuities. Next one. Past and present are connected. You cannot understand the present without understanding the past. Philip Abrahams, a book called Historical Sociology, puts it very beautifully. And you can only build the future out of the womb of the present and the past. You can't build it just like willy-nilly as if there's a tabula rasa. Whatever we're going to do in the future, even what we may want to transform, can only be done on the basis of the past and the present. Otherwise, we're living in our own worlds if we think we can just, right? Next, structure and conjuncture. These are big concepts. We work within the framework of possibilities and constraints. You can't just do whatever you want. We are shaped by social structure. What is social structure? It is the social relations under which we live. To put it in other ways, we live under capitalist social relations. Now, let's not pretend otherwise. And when you live under capitalist social relations, it structures society in a certain way. That's why we have social classes. Some people like to talk about the rich and middle classes. Let's call it what it is, the bourgeoisie that owns the means of production and owns all the factories and land and so on. In South Africa, 10% of the population, largely white, even 25 years into democracy, own 80% of everything in South Africa, including 80% of the land. What is the implications of that? For who goes to universities? For what is taught in universities? And so on. Conjuncture means the immediate conditions under which things happen. Structure is not conjuncture. So we need to understand what the social structure is. There are relations of class. There are relations of patriarchy, of gender. There are relations of ethnicity or fostered ethnicity, which the colonials brought, and so on. And we need to pay attention to these conditions under which our institutions pursue all these things. Political economy. We are not pristine islands that are not shaped by these things. We are powerfully shaped. Who goes to universities? Come on. After years and decades of trying in the United Kingdom, who goes to universities in the United Kingdom? By and large, the children of the rich and the middle classes. There are very few children from the working class families or rural poor families that go to universities. You see how structure shapes access to universities, opportunities, and so on. Periodization. I said I would come back to this. Colonial period, segregation period, apartheid period, post-1994. Note, I'm not talking about post-apartheid, like other scholars. I critique that. What you have in South Africa is not post-apartheid. You have post-1994, because apartheid is alive and well in many areas of our society. If we're really post-apartheid, would a small minority still be owning 80% of the land? If we're really post-apartheid, would we still have 40% unemployment in South Africa and 70% amongst the youth? Majority of whom are Black. So it's not post-apartheid. That's why I also find this notion of post-colonial. No, it's not post-colonial. The colonial is alive and well. That's why the concept of coloniality that comes from the decolonial school, to remind us of the continuities before and after. Okay? So that's why I periodize it in that way. In each period, I want to look at what was the thinking about universities and how they came about. What purposes are being defined for universities during the colonial period. That was a brutal period. People were exterminated, eh? And the extermination was not only of people, the extermination was also of knowledge that people had. That's why there's a term today that's called epistemicide. The knowledges that the colonialists destroyed. Because hello, as I pointed out as Seko the other day, people before the colonists arrived in Kenya or in South Africa didn't know how much fat, how much protein, how much carbohydrates to eat in order to be healthy. We didn't have to learn that from other people. Okay. So, in each of those periods, colonial period, segregation period, apartheid period, post-1994 period, what must I do? This is research now. This is what I have to do. I must analyze structure, conjuncture, domination, subordination, class, race, gender, and so on. I must understand the intellectual and scientific milieus. What were people saying? What were they thinking about? What were they doing? For many of those periods, the ideas that people had were terribly racist, patriarchal. If you don't understand that, then you don't understand why all the first higher education institutions were filled with men. Women had to battle to get into higher education institutions and universities. Now it's different in South Africa. 58% of the students in South African universities are women now. That's a different problem. And then we need to know what thinking was happening, what actions were happening, because you do know when there's exploitation or oppression, people don't sit back and fold their hands. People fight back. There's anti-colonial resistance. There's anti-apartheid resistance. So South Africa, as the last country in Africa to become free of colonialism, it doesn't happen because on one morning in 1990, F.W. de Klerk wakes up and says, we have been so bad to these Black people for so long. This is not nice. Let's change. He was forced to change. Through struggles, people died for the struggles. People didn't sit back and just accept oppression and exploitation. People fought for change. Many people died for those things. And in dying for those things and in fighting, we had our own ideas about what we would like to see to replace the colonists and apartheid. What kind of society we would like to see, what kind of education we want, what kind of universities we want, and so on. Change doesn't come about because someone wakes up one morning and says, let's be kind to Black people now. Black people take things for themselves too. That's what Black Lives Matter is all about. It's not just sitting back, right? So, important point that I'm making here is that as much as the structure and conjuncture shapes our actions can shape and remake those things. We're not condemned to be slaves forever. We're not condemned to simply accept all these things. We can do things to change it. The feminists fight for the rights of women. Society doesn't just concede all those things to women. The women had to fight for those things. That's why they have a better future today than they had in the past. Nothing comes without struggles. So I need to know also who was struggling for what, why, what did they want? So in the African context, what did Nyerere and Nkrumah and other people want in terms of higher education? Because they had ideas and they were prepared to fight for those things. Otherwise, how do you explain change? If the things that we do can't bring about change, how does change happen? Not because people wake up one morning and say we've been bad to women for too long. People are forced to bring about change. Okay? So there's always an interaction between humans, what you call agency and structure. Agency impacts on structure and changes structure, as much as structure shapes what we can and we can't do at any one point in time. So the idea, as you would know, in sociology and elsewhere, of structure and agency is profound. It's central to analyzing society and explaining change. Okay. Right, conceptual framing 6. Our universities are institutions. So Saleem better come to learn something about institutions. So I need to read a literature on institutions, because institutions are complex systems. Nairobi University is a complex system of established and embedded rules that structure. Those rules structure the relationship between a vice-chancellor and a lecturer, between the head of department and a PhD student, and so on. These institutions are also constituted by people, us, by ideas, by values, by certain norms, all those kinds of things. The idea that any staff member at any one point in time can only supervise so many PhD students or master's students, that's a norm. We work under that. And our institutions are established by binding laws. There's a law around Nairobi University. There are statutes around Nairobi University, and so on. Carry on. So I need to know about institutions and how people and institutions interact to change Nairobi. Nairobi is not what it was 20 years ago. How has it changed? Because people have acted to change Nairobi University. I was asking Professor Mbongi earlier, because the reason I'm really in Kenya at the moment and visiting Maseno and so on is for a big research commission from the Vrije University of Amsterdam. They have asked me to come and look at Maseno and Moi and so on, to see what is happening with postgraduate development at master's and PhD level. I can't do that from books. I have to come to Maseno and Moi and speak to people, because books do not tell me everything. The realities are different when you go and speak to people and learn that the so-called norm that you can only supervise so many PhD students is by default. In reality, something else is happening for good reasons. Okay? So we need to understand what institutions are, why they look the way they look. Leadership makes a difference. If you have a good vice-chancellor, certain things happen. If you don't have a good vice-chancellor, some things don't happen. Leadership makes a difference. Ask us. We know that in South Africa, because we have become the most corrupt society in Africa, because we had a corrupt previous president who has destroyed. We don't even have electricity anymore, guaranteed every day. Are you aware of that? The biggest economy in South Africa. Twice a day, we don't have power, electricity. What do you think it does to the universities? What do you think it does to experiments and so on? Look how quickly that happened in 10 years, how corrupt we have become. But our universities are not institutions only, they are, next one, are organizations also. They also have features of organizations, and they don't have a unitary character. So here's an example. I was asking Professor Mbongi, because it's relevant to my research that I'm doing for Vrije University. Does every department, does every discipline at this university have what we are having right now? This seminar. Why does history and archaeology have this and another department not have this? Maybe they don't have masters and PhD students. You'll agree that these kinds of seminars are very important if you are masters and PhD students and postdocs for intellectual exchange, right? We know this. We don't have to be taught this. Many of us have been through this, if we especially have received our master's, PhDs from York or Bristol or other universities. They are exciting places for building the next generation of academics. Sometimes the reason why something happens here is because of leadership. It happens here, but it doesn't happen there because there's no leadership. Or a misunderstanding of what a university is all about. People make a difference. Right. We are not businesses. I just want to address that last point. Universities are not businesses. Businesses at the bottom line is about making profits. For all their corporate social responsibility, the bottom line of a business is making profits. And you can only make profits by exploiting people at the end of the day, by paying them far less than what they have produced. That's the law of capitalism. Universities are not businesses. They're not here to make profits. They serve a different purpose in our societies. Too many people are forgetting that. I'm not saying we must not run our universities efficiently, effectively. That's a different issue. Of course, it must be run effectively, efficiently. Of course, if we have a certain budget, we must balance the budget, because otherwise, who's going to balance the budget? And then we're going to get into deficit, and then we're going to fire staff, and so on, right? But they are not businesses. Businesses are hierarchies. When the CEO says, do this, you jump and you do that. No, I never want to be a vice-chancellor who says, do this and jump. That's not what a university is about. University is about persuading. The people in the departments must have a lot of autonomy because they're working with knowledge. They're not making widgets, you know. They're not making cans of potatoes or whatever. If you don't have that autonomy at the lowest levels, I'm afraid you're something else. There must be autonomy, intellectual and organizational autonomy for history, for sociology, for people to do what they think is right without instructions coming from the top all the time. That's a business. Universities are holiarchies. Why? Because universities are founded on the principles of academic freedom and autonomy, institutional autonomy and intellectual autonomy. Too many people are confusing universities with businesses today. Okay. Next one. So, we need to avoid three traps when we talk about purposes, functions, and so on. First trap is essentialism, i.e., universities are the same everywhere, irrespective of time, place, and so on. We must all look like Bologna looked in 1099, or we must all look like Oxford and Cambridge. That's essentialism. You're not understanding that universities are cultural institutions that are shaped by space and time and place. Essentialism is where you think that things are unvarying over centuries. Universities are not that. They have changed over time. Secondly is relativism. The idea we can call anything a university today. Forgive me for saying this, but when I go to some places, I scratch my head and I say, this is not a university. This is like a high school. This is like a college. This is not a university. We think by giving institutions the name of the university, we make them universities. No. Universities have a certain character. They're about knowledge. And then we have a third trap, universalism. The idea that universities everywhere must be clones, replicas, imitations of what comes from Europe. Why? So I want to spend a bit more time on that universalism idea and why it's so dangerous. and why I will not go down that route when I do my research. Next one, please. The problem of universalism is associated with the problem of Eurocentrism. The first problem of universalism is it abstracts universities from time and place. The second problem is it masks a Eurocentrism. And that Eurocentrism, by the way, is associated with the decimation, erosion, and marginalization of knowledges that come from Africa and Asia and elsewhere. The idea that what comes from Europe is the only way of thinking. The idea that European knowledge is the most important knowledge, that there's only one way of knowing something. Hello, my great-great-grandparents know other ways of knowing. Hello, there was no Europe when there was a flowering of medicine and science in Persia, in North Africa, and those places. So what makes you think that you in Europe are the gift to the whole world? That your ideas are the only ideas in the world? Universalism extends to the idea, some of you are familiar with modernization theory, the idea that when we grow up as Nairobi, what must we look like? We must look like New York. Or we must look like London. And that their processes of development are universal. They're not. This is simply untrue, and people are challenging this now. This Eurocentrism has constituted science and universities all around the world. And Edward Said, we have to thank him for pointing this out to us, that as much as they claim that European ideas are universal, at the same time as they claim that, they're eliding their own particularity. They are generalizing from Europe like it applies everywhere in the world. It does not apply in those ways, especially not in the arts, culture, humanities, and social sciences. Okay, so why are we following all that? Because their knowledge is as particular. It's not universal. Next one. And this Eurocentrism gets in the way of knowledge. It destroys a curiosity. It avoids a Catholic inclusiveness where we can all talk and contribute to knowledge with respect for each other. That's the problem of universalism and Eurocentrism. Next one. So eventually I will end up with, and in the last few minutes I want to just say, for the rest I would go into what do I mean by purposes? What do I mean by functions? What do I mean by goals? What do I mean by objects? Because these are important concepts that are blurred. The distinctions are blurred. If you're not aware that these are concepts and have different meanings, then you just use these words interchangeably. You're not contributing to good knowledge because you're hiding too many things. Okay? And you must also understand this contestation about what we mean about these things. Concepts are contested. They are located in theories. There's a contestation between the global north and the global south about some of these things, and so on. Next. So let's fast forward these things. I'm happy to share the paper because then I go into defining what are purposes, what are goals, what are these things. I have to do those things if I'm going to write a good book, if I'm going to write a rigorous book. You're already saying, whoa, this guy's going to be busy for the next 5 years. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff to read, a lot of thinking to be done. Let's carry on. Carry on. Carry on. Carry on. So here's a picture of all this that I have to look at all the time, making a distinction between purposes, functions, goals and objectives, and roles, locating it within academic freedom, academic self-rule, institutional autonomy, locating it between structure, conjuncture, and so on. All concepts that I have to keep alive somewhere. Otherwise, the book's not going to be worth writing unless I can bring all these things together. Okay, next one. And so I have to explore a whole lot of themes. This will keep me busy. Carry on. Carry on. Right. So why am I doing all this? I haven't even got into empirical research yet, right? I'm only on the conceptual still. This chapter has been written in a sense. There are some chapters that are going into the periods now. So I'm about 4 chapters into an 8-chapter book, right? This conceptual frame is intended to yield an explicit. I'm making everything explicit. I'm not hiding my values. I'm not hiding anything. Because too many people hide too many things when they do research. Because the way a man looks at certain things may be different from the way a woman looks at certain things. The way someone like me from the global south and who's African looks at things is different from someone from the global north who may be white. I'm making my assumptions explicit. Too many people don't make their assumptions explicit. And I'm wanting to generate a framework of assumptions which I'm laying bare, of concepts, of analytical and empirical questions that become a checklist for me. Am I addressing the empirical question? Am I addressing the analytical question? And I'm doing all this because I can't see how I can write a good book without having something to guide me. This is my guide, this presentation, this chapter, which constitutes chapter 1 of the book after the introduction. Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay. Prof, you can have a seat briefly as you sip some water. Friends, you can agree with me that that is deep, that is radical, and that is interesting. As Prof spoke, 3 things came to mind very quickly. One, of course, is that you are a very good apostle of history, if you may allow me the latitude to use that overly Christian concept. Very good apostle of history. And I've never met in my life a sociologist who has a passion for history like the one you have demonstrated. And you are very at home in the Department of History and Archaeology here in Nairobi. Number 2, I like the way you have handled the issue of conceptual framing, because this is a struggle that I've had with my students, both at MA and PhD level. We always quarrel, and I'm sure some of you are here. We always quarrel about conceptual framing. I think probably what you have heard from Professor Saleem says it much better than I always do in our history classes. And thank you in advance for that, Prof. And, you know, number 3, you brought back very interesting memories of my days of graduation in Fitzwilliam College in Cambridge about 2 decades ago, and my gown, which I wore with a lot of pride, and walked from Fitzwilliam College to Senate House. Very interesting traditions. And I like the way you have started interrogating those institutions. You started your presentation by challenging, you know, our presumptions about what is labeled as university. Friends, not every university is a higher institution of learning. And not every higher institution of learning is a university. I thought that was really thought-provoking. And you clearly set out to kind of, if I understood you well, to elucidate, or you have this intention of elucidating the contradictions which emerged in the intersections of colonialism and the establishment of universities in Africa. And that brought to my mind about our own University of Nairobi. I wrote a piece about the history of the University of Nairobi when we were celebrating half a century of existence a few months back. And this institution emerged at a time when the colonial government was realizing that its days in Kenya were numbered, and they needed a class of technicians who could take care of their interests while they were going away. And I like the idea of looking at the context in terms of space, you know, and time and agency, which is really our forte in historical discourse. I wonder why you don't call yourself a historian, Prof. You made 3 key points very quickly, and I hope I understood your very complex way of looking at things well. One, of course, is there are no African universities, friends. This is quite interesting. There are no African universities, you know, but we have universities in Africa, which are basically citadels of Western epistemologies. So in a sense then, universities in Africa are only African geographically. You started your very interesting narrative by giving us the picture of what was happening in South Africa. And universities in South Africa started as teaching and examination bodies of European universities, you know, set up by big money, rich people. And embedded in them, there were the contradictions of racism, classism, and gender discrimination. And of course, finally, what we popularly call post-apartheid, I'm learning today that it is post-1994. Because there are fundamental continuities from the apartheid era. And that brings back the argument of Frederick Cooper in his book, Africa After 1940, where he basically sees what we popularly call independence as a transition of power from one group of elites who are basically gatekeepers to another group of elites. The only difference between them was skin color. One group was white and the other group was black. Very interesting. And that really gives us an idea that universities are microcosms of environments in which they emerge. Post-apartheid or post-94. You see now traditions don't die easily. Post-1994 produced basically compartmentalized universities or institutions in South Africa, compartmentalized into teaching, research, and comprehensive universities. Very interesting, Prof. That's how I understood what you were saying. But if you allow me, Prof, I may raise just 2 quick issues with your thoughts. One, you give us a very interesting, you know, epistemological position, which seems to me to suggest that the essence of knowledge is social justice. And I was wondering, how does that sit with what has been drilled into my mind for years, that intellectual pursuits are actually for the sake of knowledge, knowledge for the sake of knowledge. How do we juxtapose your position and this position that has been deeply ingrained in our minds, that I'm an intellectual and I'm pursuing knowledge creation for the sake of it? Number two, as you passionately talked about history of universities in South Africa, I liked the emphasis you put on the past isn't past. I hope you got that. The past isn't past. That the past continues to raise questions and issues which affect us today. Prof, that's very interesting, but the challenge I have with that is that it sounds fairly utilitarian approach to historical study, if you agree with me on that, which at times I have a feeling, and correct me please, you've been in this longer than I have been, which you know, in a way runs contrary to the very highly held notions of objectivity in historical scholarship. I'm having in mind, you know, the critique of such a utilitarian approach to historical study by Henry Butterfield, who was just like you, one time Vice-chancellor of Cambridge University. He wrote this famous book, The Whig's Interpretation of History, and provided a very interesting critique of such a kind of utilitarian approach of history, that we go back to the past to understand the present, and we use the present to prepare for tomorrow. How do you, you know, juxtapose this with the notions of historical objectivity, which some of us have been talking about all our lives? Thank you, Prof. I don't want to proceed beyond there. I just want to open up this for discussions, questions from the audience here on site, and then the audience, we will go to the audience online. Very quickly, our time is very well spent. We have about just 30 minutes to do this. I can see Mr. That is Justice Ondigi, one of our colleagues from the department. Then we have who else? Let me see your hand. I can see another colleague, Tabitha Ndogoto, over there. Yes, another one. I can see Mr. Kule, David there, a colleague also from the department. I can also see, my eyes are letting me down. Who is that? Well, yes, I hope I'll see you clearly. The light is a bit too much on my eyes. Those of you who wear glasses, you know, we don't put on this because we want to look handsome. It's because we have a disability. Who else? Yes, let's have those ones, Prof, and then we can go online. If you don't mind, you can use my book, and you can use my pen. Yeah.
Okay, so can I just start with the two?
Yes. Maybe you want to listen to her and answer them together.
Okay,
begin with
because the first two are brilliant questions and challenging questions, and they go to the heart of. So
you want to start with them, or you want to take a few more?
We can take one question at a time for me.
Okay.
I can't deal with three questions.
Oh, okay. Okay, fine. Finish with the
pen,
two that I raised, and then we have Justice. Okay. Thank you, sir.
And,
okay. Deal with the two.
So of course, this is the value of these engagements, because if I may say, you've put your finger on two very important issues, and the way you've done it is quite brilliant, I think. And you are pointing to a tension within me too, right? In terms of how I'm approaching things, okay? I struggle, Professor Mbongi. It's a real struggle between the knowledge for knowledge's sake and knowledge to serve certain purposes, right? It's one of those things that I have to come back to all the time. It's not a thing that I can settle immediately, right? So one part of me wants to defend the idea of knowledge for knowledge's sake. Do whatever you want for your PhD. Don't worry about, forget that final chapter, recommendations, right? Because people feel that unless they have policy recommendations, they've wasted 3 years of their life. No, I'm not of that school. When many people used to come to me and say, will you supervise me for a PhD? And they used to come to me because they knew I was the head of the advisory body to the minister. And they want to do policy research. I used to say to them, I don't think I'm the person to supervise you. I don't want to encourage you to do policy research for your PhD. You haven't lived long enough. This is very complicated stuff. This is very political also. And you know what? No one's going to read your final chapter recommendations. Why don't you just do a good quality research for your PhD? Because that could be as valuable as the so-called policy-oriented research, right? So part of me wants to defend that idea of knowledge for its own sake. Just do a good piece of research. Hopefully something that can be published and contribute to knowledge more generally. But then as you're picking up, I'm also highly committed to an egalitarian society, to social justice, to redress, to transforming the society. And I would like to think that this research contributes to our thinking about that, because I made it quite clear. I'm also doing this because I want to see our universities transformed, right? But I will not, so can I find, and that takes you to the second part. I am not going to do research that is going to be not dispassionate, what you're saying objective, because that doesn't help. If I'm so committed to transformation, I better be dispassionate in my approach, because otherwise it's of no use. It's not going to help transform anything, right? So I think you can find somewhere this idea that, and so sometimes I say to myself, Prof. Morgi, is knowledge always for knowledge's sake? I don't know. I think knowledge always is intended to address certain issues, right? So I would like to think that much of the knowledge for knowledge's sake does want to contribute to human understanding without it serving politicians or serving a social movement that wants socialism or whatever, right? So even knowledge for knowledge's sake, I think people undertake it because they want to contribute to human understanding. They want to contribute to our understanding of the social world and the natural world, right? So that's the tension in me. I always think it's for understanding. But then I also know that people want to contribute knowledge for social justice, whether it's about gender equity or about race equity and so on. So that's a tension you've picked up very nicely.
Thank you.
The second part of it is the historical objective thing. So no, please, if you know all the answers, why do you have to write a book? If you know how to transform society, why waste your time doing all this? I don't have the answers for this. I have hunches. Having been a vice-chancellor, having been a head of an advisory body to the minister, and so on. I have hunches about what we need to do. But I now want to spend years working out whether those hunches are right. And I want to do it dispassionately, because if I don't do it dispassionately, if I'm not objective to some extent, it's of no use, right? But the objectivity is a whole nother thing, because what I do object to is when people do research, they imagine that somehow they get out of their skins, that they're not a man anymore. No, I think you have to declare yourself that you are a man, you are black, you are an African, because I want the people in the North to declare those things, because it shapes their research, the very questions they ask, and it can also shape their findings. So that part of it, I agree with the decolonial school. No one is objective in that sense, as if you are not raced, you are not gendered, you're not classed, and things like that.
Thank you, Prof. Yes, Justice.
Thank you. Thank you, Prof, for the presentation. I have two quick ones. At some point, you talked about the periodization of South African history. There's something I didn't get right about the British time. So you talked about the colonial period, you talked about apartheid, you talked about post-1994. So the British, so which era is that? Which period is that? If you can expand on that. Then number two, I've had a very close family member in the University of Western Cape. And I'm intrigued by the white-black kind of race divide. I'm wondering, where is the place of the Indians and the coloreds? Because from what has been telling me is like the colors and Indians in Western Cape are kind of enticed to be on the side of the whites, so that the blacks are basically on the other end. What can you say about that?
Right.
Thank you.
So periodization, you know, again, I'd be fascinated to understand how you periodize Kenyan history. All I know is history is not seamless. There are breaks, all right? And so that periodization of the British period, so would be within the colonial period, between 1652 and 1910. So first Dutch colonialism, then British took over. And in 1910, there was a pact between Afrikaners and English, essentially about the oppression of black people. So the Union of South Africa was created, self-government was, that's what I call the segregation period there. Governor General, all that. But the level of self-government was given to white South Africans, not to everyone. So the Afrikaners and English came together, having fought the Anglo-Boer War between 1899 to agree to the fact that we united around one thing: oppress the blacks. The oppression is not for its own sake. It's for material reasons. It's about privilege, maintaining a certain lifestyle, and so on, right? It's about the accumulation of wealth, right? So the British would be within that period. So again, to answer, listen, South Africa is a very complicated place, very messed up place too, right? So even your term that you use, black and white, is not so straightforward. And these things are contested. Who is black and who is not black is a major contestation. For the Black consciousness movement, and this is the beauty of this, you see the apartheid state sets up these universities in 59, 60, one for Indians, one for coloreds, and ethnic lines. They thought they were going to win all of us over to the apartheid project, because what they had in mind is South Africa was going to be divided into 10 countries. What they were going to do for Indians and coloreds, we don't know. But they were going to divide people along ethnic lines. 10 countries, but with the majority of the land, and the best land would be for who? For whites, right? So they created these universities in the hope that the likes of me and Steve Biko and all of us would go to these universities and come out of there technicians. We would become the doctors, the lawyers, but where would we practice? In those 10 countries. Because white South Africa would still be the majority part of the country with all the beautiful land and harbors and all that, right? So they create these universities with the idea of, nice word, creating these technicians. But guess what happens? We think. And the people who go to these universities are what? The smartest people in the country who are black. Because you can't, not everyone can go. So Steve Biko and all these people go. And what comes out of those universities? Not technicians. Oh, yes, technicians, those people who were interested in becoming collaborators with the whites. Many of that in South Africa too. But what also comes out of those universities is something called Black consciousness. And the Black consciousness movement, spearheaded by Steve Biko, was then murdered in detention. And for the Black consciousness movement, all those people who were oppressed are Black. Indian, African, colored. Black, by the way, is not about pigmentation. Black is an ideology. People find this very hard to understand. Black is not about skin color. For the Black consciousness movement is how you think and where you stand. Because those people who were dark, who were collaborating with apartheid, were not considered Black. They were considered non-white. You see, everything is ideological and political. So what were we called before? So you know the nomenclature in South Africa. So I'm going to have to use a certain word, and I'm warning you about it. When you look at language and how it has evolved, there's the K word. Initially, under British colonialism, Dutch colonialism, we were considered Ks. The K word comes from Arabic. It is non-believer, right? Those of you who are coming from an Islamic tradition or Arabic. The K word is used for people who are, it comes from what? Kafir. People who are non, so indigenous people were called Kafirs, but they have their own word. Why? Because they are coming to civilize us. We have no religion. We have nothing. We have no culture. So they're on a civilizing mission. And that's how they justify it. Then the K word gives word to another word called native. Native is a word you use to describe flowers and plants and animals. But when you speak about people as natives, you can put them to work on the farms and the mines. That word, you see this is all happening under segregation. That word then gives way to European, non-European. And so it goes until Steve Biko comes and says, hey, whose non-whites are we? We're not your non-whites. Why do you say whites, non-whites? We are Black, right? So it's not only about skin color. It's about African Indians and colors uniting together to fight oppression. Now we have a big contestation again, because there are some people who I described as chauvinists in South Africa who are saying, no, you colored and Indians, you're not Black. You are colored and Indians. Big contestation. So even words are not straightforward in South Africa.
Well, that's an interesting one, and we can debate that for long. Let's move to Kule, but I need to confess, Prof, I now understand where you were coming from. When he sent me his profile, there was a line there which I deleted. I hope you noted that. The line I deleted was one that was saying, I was the first Black Vice-chancellor of Rhodes University. If you remember, I was like, I'm not quite sure about this, so I removed it from the e-flyer that I circulated. Now I understand where you were coming from, and that's why, in my view, you are a guru in conceptualization of some of this and framing them in ways that are very interesting. Yes, Tabitha. Very quickly, please, let's be precise. We want to go online. I can see a number of colleagues online. Prof, we had many more participants online than on site.
Okay, thanks, Prof, for such a good presentation, that not all institutions of higher learning are universities. That is a very difficult term. My first question is that in the recent, we are seeing the rise of Swahili language to be embraced as an African language of communication. Do you think if it is embraced and replaces English that is a Western language, will it be able to give a new look to our universities? The second question, you have told us that universities are not businesses. My question is, where do we place our privately owned universities in Africa and particularly in Kenya, because they are owned by individuals? Thank you.
Okay, so Swahili, okay, so you'll understand that mother tongue is very important, especially if you want to learn concepts and so on, right? That's why it is argued that if you want to produce people who can really think and conceptualize and theorize and so on, start with mother tongue at preschool and primary school and so on, and then go into parallel with English and so on, right? Because we are also realists, right? We do understand that the dominant language and power and so on, if you want to succeed today, is English, right? And it's been like that for a long time, okay? So, question, what prevents us from having a university in Swahili, in East Africa? What stops us from having a university in West Africa, in Yoruba, and so on? Because it's been done before. As Mahmoud Mandani points out, and he's got a big project on decolonizing universities in South Africa, right? Afrikaans is an indigenous language. There was no Afrikaans before. Afrikaans is a mixture of English, Indonesian, Malaysian, German. It is what the Afrikaners in South Africa created a social movement around that. And I think we must learn from that. Because even though they did it for the wrong reasons, right? And it was oppressive and so on, they showed how you can create a language that can become the language of science and university teaching. It's not going to happen overnight. Afrikaans didn't become a language of science and universities overnight. It took decades for that to happen. The University of Pretoria, when it started in 1907, was an English language. In the 1930s, it moved to Afrikaans. Stellenbosch, the famous Stellenbosch University, is English today. When it started, it was English, but it became Afrikaans. You have to invest a lot of money, time, to develop the vocabulary, right? Because in many indigenous languages in South Africa, there is not words for certain things. So, capital, there's no word for capital. Because capital is something that's related to capitalism and starts in Europe. So in local language, there's no word for capital. But you and I can sit around and table and come to a word and say, for capital, we will have this word, right? You construct the language. Afrikaans has shown that. And Mamdani is going to be arguing, interestingly, I think, in a concept paper I've seen, that Afrikaans is a decolonial language. And that we can learn from that. That's going to be controversial. But I take his more serious point. If you want a university in Swahili, you can have it, as long as you're prepared to invest money in it. It can be done. So why don't we want that? Okay. So that's on that. So your question about private universities is spot on. There are two kinds of private universities that I understand it. One are independent. They're linked to churches, they're linked to foundations and things like that, right? They're not for profit necessarily. So many of the liberal arts colleges in the United States, the prestigious ones, very expensive, $60,000 a year, and so on. They're not necessarily for profit, but they are private universities, right? And then there are those called universities that are for profit, right? And perhaps many in Africa, their bottom line is not knowledge. The bottom line is about making money. So by the way, in South Africa, there are no private universities. There are 75 to 80, I don't care what you call them. You can call them colleges, schools, institutes, I don't care. But they are not universities. Why? So when I was the head of the advisory body to the minister, and when Monash University came, and when they demanded the status of university, the minister said to you, Saleem, so what are we going to do? So I said, we're not going to compromise on what is a university. Monash is a university in Australia. It's got less than 200 students in South Africa. Where's its library? Where's its multiple faculties and so on? One day when it grows up, maybe we'll let it call itself university. When it grows up. For the moment, even today, 25 years later, it's still Monash College. So it can call itself a college, but not a university. So university is a protected term in South Africa. I'm thankful for that we haven't allowed every institution to call itself a university, because it's not a university. So I think we must distinguish between the privates, and then we have to work out what is it that you want to protect. Call yourself whatever you want, not a university.
Thank you. I just hope that the commission, our Commission for University Education, is listening. You know, when you grow up, I think there are a few of our institutions which needed to grow a little bit. David, just make it simple because we want to go online. A number of colleagues have waited enough online, please.
Yes, I'm going to be so brief. Thank you, Prof, for a very interesting presentation that is also well presented. I'm just going to go straight to two issues. One is the concept of open universities. And
open
universities. Yeah. There's that animal which is circulating in academia and also in politics. Here in Kenya, just as recent as yesterday, the president talked about it. Even the Minister of Education talked about it in Parliament yesterday. And I'm wondering, in your view, and with your history of universities, what you think this holds for? And then the second one, which may be related to that, is the decolonization of curriculum. How do we decolonize, for example, the history curriculum or the law curriculum and others? You know, thank you.
Sure. So quickly on the open, there are different notions of open. So in South Africa, those historically white universities like Cape Town, Witwatersrand, and Natal in Durban were called open universities. You know why? Because they allowed a few Black students to come in there. So they were called open. But usually today, open universities are often referred to in terms of open distance learning. And we've got the biggest one in Africa, in South Africa, called University of South Africa. Of the 1.2 million university students in South Africa, 400,000 today at UNISA. Open distance, i.e. not face-to-face. It's all online. It started as a correspondence college, right? So what do I think about that? When you look at the pass rates of UNISA compared to other universities, they're not very good. When I was head of the advisory body to the minister, and when we did the research, 10% of the students were passing economics 1. 90% were failing, right? Now, I do believe you can have high quality open distance learning, but you must put a lot of money into it. Because people are speaking a lot about open and open distance and online and so on, thinking they can provide access to more people, perhaps, but will you have the same quality? And my own view is, if you are serious about giving access to people who come from poor families, from working class families and rural poor families, I think they need to be in a residential situation. They need to be in residences, ideally where they can get 3 meals a day, right? And they have face-to-face interaction. Otherwise, the attrition rates and the dropout rates are going to be terrible. So too many people and leaders are speaking about opens as a panacea for so-called access. And it's not really about, because there'll be access, but there'll be no opportunity or outcomes. I'm interested in equity of access. Everyone who's talented should go, not just the rich. Equity of opportunity. Everyone should have opportunity, not just the rich. and outcomes, right? So I think people are seeing open universities as a panacea for access, but I'm not speaking about opportunity and I'm not speaking about quality.
All right, thank you. Talk about opportunity.
So decolonizing the curriculum.
Yeah.
I think that is the challenge. If you want to become African universities, if you want to become South African universities, then you start to decolonize the curriculum. Now, does Saleem know what a completely decolonized curriculum is? No, I don't. But what I do know is we need to do that, and we need to start sitting together and talking about how we decolonize the curriculum. Does decolonization mean Africanization? Does it mean indigenization? What does it mean? What does it mean in terms of texts that are prescribed? What does it mean epistemologically? What does it mean ontologically? Big issues. And these issues are being grappled with at South Africa, sometimes successfully, not successfully. So when I was at the Mellon Foundation in New York, I made grants totaling probably about $10 million to universities in South Africa around these efforts, right? And so I am very interested in what, as you have said, what will a decolonized curriculum look like in history, in philosophy, in anthropology, and so on? Or more radical, will we even have anthropology? Given the history of anthropology in Africa, it's not a glorious history. So we need to interrogate where these disciplines come from, why they were introduced to Africa, and how you decolonize them, or even whether we will have some of those disciplines, or whether you can't approach knowledge in a different kind of way.
Yeah, I mean, Mr. Kule, the one who asked the question, sits in our curriculum review committee of both the department and the faculty. So, David, this is a subject that we need to have a bit of conversation on.
But there's a growing literature around.
Yes.
Look around.
Yeah.
Lots of people are seriously grappling with this.
Yeah. And you talk about access. I was referring to Amartya Sen's understanding of poverty as lack of access. So you see, as you deal with issues of access, think also about opportunity. I think that's important. Let's have the last one here, and then we will go online. Dr. Reginald, we are seeing you, and Doreen Olembo, just give us a minute. We have the last question, we'll come to you.
Okay. My name is Loving Laura, an undergraduate student, probably somebody out of place in the building. I have a question. Okay, I have understood Professor has brought out the aspect of predatory liberalism quite well. And my question is, what role have universities played in promoting social justice and transformation in South Africa? And then is there a nexus between the tripartite alliance and the South African university with regards to the social justice and transformation? Thank you.
Okay, so what roles have universities played in South Africa in terms of social justice? Very mixed roles, I think. And it also depends on the university and its leadership and its history and all those kinds of things, because we inherited historically Black, historically white. These terms are still operating, right? The historically Black universities were never meant to be for engineering and for there's no engineering, medicine, and all those things at those. Those are all of the historically white universities, right? So we've gone furthest in terms of social justice, in terms of access. We've gone from 473,000 students in 1993 to 1.2 million. Now that's access. Is there real opportunity? Well, you decide. Because if 100,000 students enroll at our universities in a year, for argument's sake, 50,000 will never graduate. No, I'm saying never graduate, even after 10 years. 50% will never graduate from our universities. From our University of Technology, the figure was 60%. And today, every undergraduate student whose family earns under a certain amount has a full scholarship. That was Zuma's gift, right? That's incredible attrition rates. And they are not unlinked. There's a nexus between that and race and class and so on, and gender. Actually, women do far better than men at universities in South Africa. For example, the university I was Vice-chancellor with, 58% are women. But when it comes to graduations, 62% are women. So then you have to start worrying. I mean, before we celebrate this too much, let me just give a warning. Think about this. If 58% are women, only 42% are men. And yet the population is 50-50, right? So in terms of gender equality, you may say that's great. I'm worried about where are the Black men. And some of us worry that the levels of gender violence we get in South Africa may be related to some of these things, of men thinking that the real beneficiaries of post-94 have been women. So the levels of brutality and the gender violence, we are the rape capital of the world. 1 in 9 women will get raped in South Africa. So before we celebrate that too much, we better start understanding what's going on in our universities. Where are the men, the young Black men especially? So universities contribute in different ways to social justice. At the same time, universities also reproduce the status quo. You can't run away from that. It's a mixture. At the same time that you may contribute to more deracializing and non-racialism, you could be reproducing patriarchy in different ways, and so on. So I don't think there's any clear relationship between what universities do and social justice. Universities are both reproductive of the status quo, and they're also transformative in some senses. In what ways are they reproductive? In what ways are they transformative? That's the challenge, I think. And you have to look at each institution, you have to look at its leadership, and so on. We talk a lot about transformation in South Africa. You need to dig a bit more about what we mean by that.
All right, thank you. Our undergraduate student, you are the right person in the right place. This is where you belong, and we want to see you more and more, and many others. So don't feel out of place. Let's go online. Let's begin with Doreen Olembo, and then we will go to Oduol, and then Francis Owaka, and we will take a question at a time, and the speaker will respond.
Thank you, sir, for that opening lecture. My question is seeing that most of the underlying issues, socioeconomic, would the education system consider a socioeconomic perspective, for example, come up with a syllabus or engage like the commerce industry to relax trade opportunities, business opportunities, and scale it down so that the masses are easily able to access capital, then that would reduce the pressure up there. That would reduce also the pressure of enrollment, such that people are able to enroll when they are able financially, and most of the socio-political problems solved at the same time. So is it possible to consider a socio-economic context rather than a socio-political?
My general comment will be that you can't transform the world without education or higher education. But education and higher education on its own can't transform the world. We give too much credit to think that universities and education can transform the world. If you want to really transform the world, transform the politics and economics of our societies, right? So engaging with industry around curriculum issues, if you're in engineering, if you're in sciences and so on, yes. What are the development needs of our societies? What are the national development needs and so on? How might we produce graduates who have the attributes, the qualities, right, that can contribute to development in Africa and so on? So I'm all for that, right? But as we engage with those sectors, we must also be careful, I think. Because too many times my engagements with those people seem to think that when we graduate them, they must be ready to work for the bank. They must be ready to work for Kenya Airways. That's not what universities do. Universities produce for the financial services sector. They produce for certain sectors. And it's about providing them with knowledge, expertise, skills, and competencies. And each one of those things is different. It's a configuration, right? So I think, yes, we must engage with the rest of society, whether it's the private sector, whether it's a public sector, and listen to what kinds of graduates we are needed and so on. But we mustn't just do it in a blind way, because universities serve certain functions. TVET colleges play a different function. So how closely you work with industry and so on also depends on what kind of higher education institution you are, right? Universities will not provide capital and things like that. It's the state or the private sector that provides those things, right?
Okay. Very interesting. In matters transformation of society, the politics and economics is important. In this case, universities are overrated. That's Prof. Dr. Oduor, please unmute and proceed.
Thank you very much, Professor Umbongi, and thank you, Professor Saleem, for a most enlightening talk. I have been trying to think through a matter that I think touches on what you have presented today, the relationships among worldview, ideology, theory, practice. Worldview, ideology, theory, practice. And I'm fascinated by your perspective on the universities, because here, as the undertones of some of the contributions might indicate, we are also in the throes of neoliberalism and being asked to make profits and so on. But I am curious about this because of the discussion you've had with Professor Umbongi about disinterested pursuit of knowledge, whether it can even be done at all, or I would add, whether it's just a Western elitist fad. So kindly share with me your perspective on the relationship between these things. Thank you.
Important question. I find it hard to accept that worldviews and ideologies do not shape how we see the world. If you have been brought up in a Catholic family and you're a strong Catholic, or if you've been brought up in a Muslim family and you subscribe to Islam and so on, those are not just religions. Those are ways of being. They shape your identity. They shape how you approach things. They shape what you think about gay and lesbians and so on. Right? We must not pretend that those worldviews and ideologies don't shape how we theorize, how we even define what is important and what is not important for research and so on. Right? I think for too long, intellectuals and scholars have hidden those things. Why is Saleem interested in the things that he's interested in? Because Saleem has a certain worldview. He has a certain ideology. He's shaped and influenced. It's part of his identity. Right? So I think we must make those things explicit. And I value the decolonial school because it's saying there's a body politics. We must declare that. Right? Because it does shape the questions we ask. It does shape how we approach things. It does shape whether we think there's objective knowledge or whether knowledge is always contaminated. Right? But at the same time, I always want to say, you know, you can be as committed as you want to find a cure for HIV/AIDS. But falsifying the results is not going to help us do that. You have to be disinterested. Because if you're not disinterested, we're not going to find the cures. So that's what I mean. Now, of course, that's in science. In humanities, social sciences, a bit different, perhaps, okay? And so I think we should be, especially at postgraduate level, as we are training masters, PhD students, and so on, we should be arguing about the history of science and where science comes from, and the philosophy of science and things like that, right? So that we can put to bed also these quaint notions that science is Western. Sorry, science is not Western. Science was happening in India, in Persia, in Asia, when Europe was in the Dark Ages. That's what we learned, right? Even that periodization, by the way, we must question. Dark Ages, Middle Ages. Sorry, that was Europe. The Islamic world was not in the Dark Ages. North Africa was not in the Dark Ages. It was a flowering of medicine. And go to South Spain, go to Andalusia, go to Granada, and you'll see that, right? So I think we have to have a more complex notion around what is science, who produces science, where science comes from, and worldview, ideology, and theorization, and so on. I'm all for making those things explicit so that the assumptions are laid bare. And then you can tell me, yeah, Saleem, maybe some of your ideology is getting in the way. Okay, let's debate it. How's it getting in the way? I'm making it explicit. I'm for transformation. I'm for social justice. The questions that interest me are about questions about gender equity and so on. So I think we should be talking about these things far more, especially with our PhD students and young scholars and so on. We must not imagine knowledge is neutral. We must not imagine that any of us comes to these issues in a value-neutral way or a value-free way. That I don't accept. We are all shaped by where we come from.
Okay. Dr. Duor is our colleague from the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies, and I hope you have gotten the point. Now, finally,
Yes, thank you very much.
Worker from the same department, please proceed. Francis was meant to be the discussant in this session, and then he was found out that he was supposed to teach. So I stood in for him. I hope I filled in his big shoes. Yes, Dr. Worker, please.
Yes, thank you for filling in my big shoes. But I want to thank Professor for the wonderful and the most enlightening lecture. But I've been just wondering, from your talk.
Dr. Worker, we can't hear you. Unmute and proceed, please.
Oh my God. Avanam, can you hear me now? No?
Actually, some of us can hear him.
Yes, I'm wondering. Ken, can you hear me? Too bad.
Yes, can proceed, please.
You can hear me? Okay, mute and then I'll talk. It will make a lot of... You can hear me now? Yes. So I was saying that thank you for the fantastic lecture, Professor. I was just wondering, there's a question that keeps coming to my mind, and that question falls within African studies and what you've just shared with us. There is a talk that there is nothing African about African studies. Now, here you have made a very interesting observation that actually there are no African universities. Are we soon going to see the exit of Western universities and the birth of African studies? And what is your projection? Give us your projected time span, 10 years, because take note, I think you gave this talk in the wrong place. Most Kenyan universities are actually business universities, including where you are. Thank you.
That part of it, I'm a guest here. I can only speak about South African universities. You're right, South African universities are not South African. The universities in South Africa. And in my view, too many in the name of entrepreneurialism are becoming something else. It's not about the pursuit of knowledge, it's about the pursuit of subsidy, right? But that's because of our funding system in South Africa. Because in South Africa, every PhD you graduate, the government gives you 350,000 rands. When Saleem publishes his next book, the university is going to get almost 1 million rands. Every journal article, every book chapter that's peer reviewed that I publish, the university will get 150,000 rands for that. You see what that can do? It can corrode knowledge. Because there's a danger that people are walking around with PhDs who shouldn't be walking around with PhDs. It's giving rise to the worst kinds of behavior, predator journals, and so on. Why? Because there's a financial incentive tied to the production of knowledge. So it's no longer knowledge for its own sake. Not even knowledge for social justice. It's knowledge to put money in my pockets. And South African academics are well paid relative to academics elsewhere. So it's important that the things that we take for granted, and I think that's what you're saying, Prof, the things we take for granted that we consider natural, we must make them strange instead of just taking them as natural. When people say to us, we get offended when they say Black people are inferior, they can't think, they don't have higher mathematical abilities, right? Naturally, we are offended because that's not true. But sometimes when they say that about women, we agree. Because we have so been indoctrinated about men being superior to women that we won't challenge. We'll even agree and raise a toast to that. We've got to start making things. So where am I going with this? I don't know. It's something I agonize about. We are Africa. Can we have African studies in Africa? Do Americans have North American studies or American studies all over in the universities? I don't know. Do the Europeans all have European studies? But often more African studies is done in Europe and North America than here. Isn't everything African studies in Africa? So why do we have specialist African studies? Shouldn't an African theorizing approach be informing every discipline? Now, I can argue for strategic reasons why some people should be in African studies, in the same way there should be people in gender studies to help us think through these issues in the disciplines that we work in and so on, so that the best minds come together and say, this is the kind of changes we need to do in our disciplines. We need to bring a gender perspective into all our disciplines, right? And the people in the gender studies help us think around those kinds of things. The same of African studies. So that's what I mean by making the natural strange. Why do we just take something called African studies and set up these things at our universities? In the same way, I really take offense. Even at Rhodes University, I used to challenge the head of music. Why do you call this ethnomusicology? When people are doing these things in Lund in Sweden, they don't call it ethnomusicology, they call it musicology. When we have a particular approach to maths, which is great, we call it ethnomaths. What are we doing to ourselves by calling these things ethno? Why is it not just maths? Have we got nothing to contribute to the rest of the world? Don't we think? Don't we theorize? We respect you as people who think about these things. Why don't you respect us as people who think about these things, as people who have knowledge to contribute to the world, right? So I think sometimes our universities themselves need to start thinking about things, about what do we even call ourselves, because names matter. How we name things, what we call things, and so on, those things matter. So in short, I don't have to tell Kenyans about this great person called Ngugi. I agree with him. Starts with the decolonization of the mind.
Thank you.
We don't decolonize the mind, we're not going to decolonize anything.
Thank you very much, Prof. Thank you so much. We will end it there. Kindly take your seat. I think we need to give a better hand of applause for that. Let me begin with a very sincere apology. We have exceeded our time by 15 minutes. This is because we started a few minutes late. So if you have sat longer than you usually do, if you have stayed online slightly longer than you do, receive our apologies. Mine now is very simple: to sincerely thank Professor Saleem Badat for this wonderful presentation, very radical and a very new way of looking at things. And I'm looking forward to our project. I hope Codestria will fund it to engage on these things much more. And I'm looking forward to engage with my colleagues in the department more on this. I want to thank our students who made it here today, our PhD, our master's students, our undergraduate students. I also want to thank those who have been listening to us from different parts of the world. I saw colleagues from the US. I saw a friend of mine from all the way from Australia. I saw somebody I know from that part of the world. And we appreciate all of you. Colleagues in the department, thanks for coming in, and thanks for the unity and cooperation that always leads to these programs, and thanks for coming. And finally, I want to thank our departmental administrator and the students who help in this. Amos, where are you? Is Amos still around? That is the man who works behind the scenes to make things happen. And as Napoleon once said, it is the soldiers who fight, but the generals receive praise on their behalf. So all the praises that we receive as chair of department and as staff come from our departmental registrar, Amos Gitonga, who is at the back. So all of you, thank you for coming. Our colleagues from Warwick, Ian, our colleague from California, and our colleague from Langsburg, Soja, we are happy to have you here. Thank you, and God bless you all. We end it here.